My name is Elisabeth Braw. I lead the Modern Deterrence project at the Royal United Services Institute in London. It's the UK's defence and security think tank. Modern Deterrence looks at how liberal democracies can better defend themselves against the increasing number of forms of aggression and threats that face them today. My lecture looks at the forms of aggression that face our societies, and what's really important about that is that it's not just kinetic forms of aggression anymore, it's forms of aggression that target civil society, our way of life, and it's forms of aggression that are non-kinetic, so they don't use traditional military weapons, they're just ways of subverting our societies, of harming our societies. For example, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and weaponization of globalization, where countries that are hostile to ours take advantage of the globalized nature of societies to, for example, harm our companies and indeed to buy them up so that they are no longer our companies, but theirs. So what's changing with these different forms of aggression is that the people who need to defend our countries, it's not just the armed forces anymore, but all of society. So that means the whole of government, but also industry and, in fact, the population as a whole. So everybody can do something to help keep the country safe, whether that is checking information before they share it on social media, whether that is knowing what to do in case of a cyber attack, or whether that is legislating to make it harder for other countries to acquire our companies in areas of cutting-edge technology, for example. What's also changing is the way that our armed forces are set up. So there is a really interesting innovation going on in, for example, Norway, where they've for many years now had competitive national service. So the best and the brightest boys were selected for national service. Now that has changed, so it's gender-neutral national service. The best and the brightest boys and girls are selected, still the same number, so it's very competitive, and as a result, it's very prestigious to be selected, and it's fantastic entry to have on your CV. And yes, that's military service, but what it does is create this notion among the wider population that they can be part of national security, they can be part of keeping the country safe, and even if they are interested in a civilian career afterwards, which is the case in with most of these young people, they will have served with the Norwegian Armed Forces and will have at the back of their heads the idea about what the threats are to their country, in that case Norway, and how they can help to keep the country safe. Total defense is something that Sweden created during World War II when it was neutral, and it really faced a terrible dilemma. So it was neutral, which meant they didn't have the support of the Allied countries, but it also faced Nazi Germany alone. And what do you do if you're a small country and you face Nazi Germany alone, and you know that Nazi Germany is likely to invade your country, had invaded Norway and Denmark, Sweden's closest neighbors, and as well as Finland. Finland had been invaded by both Germany and the Soviet Union. So Sweden was the only country that hadn't been invaded, and had to figure out a way to at least put up as much resistance as possible. So he came up with this idea of total defense, where everybody was going to be involved in at least slowing down a Nazi invasion of Sweden. In the end, the Germans didn't invade, and so that that total defense was never executed, but they practiced for it. And then during the Cold War, Sweden built on that and perfected that total defense system, because after World War II, as we all know, the Soviet Union became the most serious adversary, in fact, the only adversary. And Sweden is, of course, geographically close to Russia and to then the Soviet Union. So it was really important to mobilize all the resources within the country to make it as difficult as possible for the Soviets to invade. So that meant people, for example, lending their vehicles to the armed forces, people keeping the country going when men were mobilized to serve in the armed forces. And all of that was extremely well planned and executed. So lots and lots and lots of civilians had wartime roles that they would have taken over during a conflict with the Soviets, and they also, lots of others had supporting roles, supporting the armed forces. Again, for example, lending their vehicles, supplying working animals to the armed forces and so forth. After the Cold War, that system was almost completely dismantled. It's now being resurrected, obviously, with an updated profile, because now we don't really, Sweden really doesn't face the threat of a Soviet invasion anymore, even though Russia is a mighty adversary. But there are all these new threats that make it even more vital for the population and all parts of society to be involved in defense. When people think about deterrence, they think about nuclear weapons. That's sort of where the term has become famous. So you deter a country from using nuclear weapons against your country by having an equivalent arsenal of nuclear weapons. So that's what we had during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States squared off in nuclear deterrence. But today we need additional deterrence, because we have all these new threats that are of a non-kinetic nature, cyber attacks, disinformation, predator economics. How do we defend ourselves against that? And how do we signal to our adversary that that it wouldn't make sense to engage in those forms of aggression against us? We haven't succeeded so far, and the way we know that we haven't succeeded is that those forms of aggression keep growing. If we can signal to our adversaries through deterrence by resilience, by knowing what to do in case of a successful attack, then it will become less palatable for the adversary to engage in such aggression. So deterrence by resilience is the ability to absorb an attack and to keep going with limited disruption. Then you obviously need the traditional form of deterrence by punishment, but the big piece that's missing today is deterrence by resilience, and that's something that we can all be involved in, regardless of what we think about the armed forces and use of weapons. Keeping the country safe, keeping the economy going, keeping daily life going, that is deterrence by resilience. And that's something where, everybody from young to old can be involved.